Hello, this is going to be a pretty short video for you about the life of Alfred Lord Tennyson, who writes In Memoriam and Charge of the Light Brigade, the Charge of the Light Brigade. Um, the first thing I want to talk to you about is who he was in relation to the Victorian era. I've put up a couple of videos about British Empire, and I talked about the psychological effects of feeling a member of the British Empire. Um, Alfred Lord Tennyson is not technically the poet laureate of an entire era, but he could be. He could be the message bearer of the Victorian era to us. And here's why. First of all, if the Victorian era has much at all to do with Queen Victoria and a reverence for Queen Victoria, Alfred Lord Tennyson was incredibly well placed to be such a reverent figure. He is not born a lord, nor is he born likely to ever become a lord. He is vaguely aristocratic. He is, poor relations of aristocratic family. And he starts writing, and not a ton of people are paying attention to his first book. And then I think he publishes a second book, and he's really quite poor. And he's got to live on an island off the coast of England. I think it's the Isle of Wight, if I'm not mistaken. I could be wrong about which isle. I think it's the Isle of Wight. And as it turns out, Prince Albert, who is married to Queen Victoria, is a thinking man and reads a lot. And he gets a hold of, I think it's Tennyson's second book, and really digs it. I mean, he really likes the book. And he had already tried to get his family away from all of the palace protocol. He believed in long walks in nature and things like that as a something that would be good for his children. And he and the Queen spent a little bit of time on the Isle of Wight what's really, I mean, look, we would all be so fortunate, I'm sure, to have such a gorgeous house as the royal family had on the Isle of Wight. But by comparison to, say, Buckingham Palace, it's kind of, it's not a cabin in the woods, but it's it's not as fancy as a castle. So they go to their mansion on the Isle of Wight, and then Prince Albert finds out that poet he likes, that guy Alfred, he lives on the island with his family permanently because he can't afford to live on the mainland. And so he goes off to see him and get his book signed. You can imagine what a lucky break that is for a poet, to have the head consort of the royal family that sets style for England. If the monarchs are the arbiters of taste. Today, most people do not try to dress like Queen Elizabeth II, but if Queen Elizabeth II says something is tacky, maybe everybody thinks it's a little tacky. Could be. In any case, back when Queen Victoria was queen, if the royal family thought something was fashionable, if we are going to wear hoop skirts because Queen Victoria wears hoop skirts, then that's what we're going to do. In fact, if you've ever known anybody who got married in a white dress, it's because of Queen Victoria. That was not fashionable at all until she decided to wear a white dress, which she believed to be signifying her purity. We get it not from some other tradition, we get it from her. So the royal family around Victoria and Victoria herself are arbiters of taste. So if Prince Albert is willing to say or do anything publicly that says, I like this poet, it's like Steven Spielberg making a movie out of your novel these days. Everybody knows who you are. They're probably going to buy a copy of your book. So after their meeting and long discussion, Alfred Lord Tennyson, or he was not yet Lord, decides to write a long poem called The Idylls of a King that kind of has an Arthurian bent to it, but is kind of a coded discussion of the thoughts of Albert, Prince Albert. Needless to say, the royal family loves this pro-monarchy, comparing Albert, the prince, to King Arthur in a good way. They love it. So they talk about it. They essentially talk up the epic poem, which is published. And all of a sudden, Alfred is big time. He is the poet that everybody's talking about. And the truth is, he's got skills. You may not love everything he writes about. The man has skills. I've provided you with just a couple of examples of it, his work, but some of what he's out of fashion because he's so pro-monarchy, so pro-empire. But and everything is very precise, but it takes a lot of work to make language do what he makes it do. I'm not telling you to love him, but I am telling you to respect how hard it is to do what he does. And so we have these poems that are wildly popular, and he writes multiple works that are supportive of the British Empire and supportive of monarchy specifically in England. And the Queen has the power once in a while to make someone a lord. She doesn't just hand that out like candy. It usually goes to cousins. So it's a huge deal that someone who is so far removed from her ends up getting a title that, by the way, still exists. There's another Lord Tennyson who is the direct descendant of Alfred Lord Tennyson at this point. I'm not sure how many they've gone around, but in any case, Alfred Lord Tennyson is now part of the nobility because of his noble verses, and he writes very, very glowingly about the empire. When we read The Charge of the Light Brigade, we ought to be astonished that it is a poem glorifying what was a military mistake, followed by a military catastrophe in a war that had a lot of casualties and was pointless, in the Crimea, which is in modern-day Ukraine, on the Black Sea. The English thought they had a political interest in holding that land. They failed to do so with a lot of bloodshed. It was a very unpopular war. And there were lots of military mistakes, blunders, and misjudgments. And so Alfred Lord Tennyson talks about the charge of this brigade as if it were the most heroic victory, except they all get slaughtered, like nobody returns. That's how bad the mistake is. So you will read it and you will understand that, based on what I said before, the thing that he is glorifying is their absolute commitment to duty, even when duty is stupid, even when it makes no sense. Nothing was gained by the charge of the Light Brigade militarily. Nothing was gained politically. Rather, Alfred Lord Tennyson sees this as a moment to glorify the willingness to submit to the imperatives of the ranking system, the aristocratic and military industrial systems of the empire. And it's a beautiful poem. I wonder if it's well advised, quite frankly, but it is a beautiful poem. He also writes quite movingly about the death of his best friend that he just can't get over for the longest time. His friend dies when they're both young. Imagine if God forbid, one of your best college friends died suddenly. And you have to explain that to yourself. How is this possible? This person was so lively and bright. How can we even go on? Is there even a God? Is God watching? You know, I read that thing about from Darwin about how we all evolve from, different creatures that were first one-celled, then we end up going through, the primates. Maybe God doesn't exist at all, right? Maybe it's all just one big illusion. Well, the poem wrestles mightily with these existential issues in beautiful language, redolent with grief. And they're magnificent moments of this poem. They're just beautiful. What I will say, though, is that the poem was about his friend, but Queen Victoria particularly prized this poem because there was a grief in her life she was having a lot of trouble getting over when her husband died relatively young, the same guy who had gotten his book signed on the Isle of Wight by Alfred Lord Tennyson. That guy dies young, and she never gets over it. She wears mourning for him every day for the rest of her very long life. She even considers, to some degree, laughing decades later, some kind of betrayal of the memory of him. She should be in a sort of white hot state of grief, in her view. She has his clothes laid out in a bedroom that would have been his bedroom every single day for the rest of her life. This is a mourning that's hard to even imagine today. And the Victorians knew how to mourn in a way. If you look at the traditions even of the South in mourning, the traditions that would have been more or less in sync with the traditions of England at that time during the Confederacy, women would wear a floor-length veil for a year. Only after a year might they take it up to like waist length or elbow length. For another year, they would wear a short veil around their necks. Anytime they went out, a black veil. They would wear black for a spouse for years. Victoria does beyond what the society would have expected, 3 years on the outside. And toward the end, you're in what's called half mourning, meaning you might include gray and purple, not just black, in what you wore if you were in mourning. And it had been maybe 3.5 years. But Victoria is devastated to her core, and this poem resonates with her. And it resonates with other people who are, so many people lose people when they're young. And we forget what that's like to some degree because we have an expectation based on modern medicine that people are likely to live a long time. But the truth is that even today, people die young sometimes. It's a poem that ultimately affirms God in memoriam, but you see his metaphysical wrestling. This is not part of the metaphysical poets, to be clear, but he's wrestling with the problem of why does God allow bad things to happen to good people? The problem of theodicy that I mentioned before to you. So I hope you enjoy Tennyson. I think he's worth your time. I say this about everything I've put on the syllabus, but I absolutely do. I think it's entirely appropriate to question the pro-empire, pro-government agenda of a guy like Tennyson. It's a little heavy-handed. It's a little uncomplicated. Government is, something that we ought to view with a little side eye. Maybe it's good we have it. Maybe we want limits to it. I don't sense this in Tennyson's work, but his work is quite lovely. And I hope you will enjoy him.